I'm going to change the slides. While I do that, are there any questions that you have at the moment?
Yeah, you said they were difficult to find. What does that mean?
Sorry?
When they were sent to various
Oh,
probationary
Yeah.
stations,
what
they
I'm
were
saying is,
difficult to find.
when I go to look for them today, the probation stations, and you'll see shortly the size of them, you can't find them. There's no interpretive signs up. Most of the buildings have been destroyed. They're all owned privately. So I had a heck of a time finding them in 1995 when I first went there. And that's why I encouraged the state to put up some signage like we have here. So that's what I meant there. It sounded like maybe it was hard for the prisoners to find them.
What was the percentage that returned from Van Diemen's Land back to England or Canada once you got there?
That's a good question. It was how many of these prisoners returned. Well, most of the English prisoners, even though they could go back, decided to stay in Australia. And if you read Robert Hughes's book called Fatal Shore, that's the first kind of Australian book Australians didn't want to admit because a lot of their relatives were prisoners. But most of them stayed. They didn't want to go back. The men I'm talking about said, we're slaves. We're here illegally. And the majority of them, either they died or they did go back to the United States. But the majority of felons chose to stay. They had a better life. You know?
When was Sir John Franklin? Wasn't he? He was there with his wife. She hated it. She hated the climate. She thought it was a demeaning position.
Well, I don't know about that. One of the reasons Franklin was driven out was that the locals felt that Lady Franklin was dictating what he did.
Yes,
So
well, she did all his life, though, didn't she?
I guess, wait till you see a picture I've got of the statue of Franklin. Anyway, let me show you about the question about how troubles to find. After the attempt of escape, or the escape at Sandy Bay, Franklin was so incensed that he sent them, remember they're all together, North American political prisoners, he sent them inland, the Lovely Banks. Now, this is all that's left of Lovely Banks. You know, it's not a big tourist attraction, it's a bunch of rubble, so it's hard to find. There's some more archaeological remains. There's the quarry, though, that they were quarrying stone, they were building a road north of Launceston. So that's the quarry as it exists today. This just shows you the general area, the type of buildings. This is an 1840 shearing shed made out of sandstone. Another sandstone barn at the Lovely Banks farm. This gives you an idea of the landscape, and it's always looked like this because there weren't many trees, and also the Aboriginals would burn. That was the way that they fertilized. So that's what it looks like in the Midlands. This is a bridge. The men I'm talking about actually built that bridge in 1840, and it's still there. This is part of the road work that they were involved in. That gives you an idea of the stonework of that bridge at Lovely Banks. Another view of it. So that's the kind of work they would do. They would haul stone, they would build culverts and bridges. This gives you an idea of the road they built. That's the actual road going north up to Tedworth. And this is looking back down towards the Lovely Bank farm. This is the watch house at Tedworth in 1840. This is not part of the probation station, but it's the local police station. And this is the wonderful London Inn. This was built in 1831. It was one of the first roadhouses on the original road. The veranda was added on at the turn of the 19th century, but this is the type of building that they would have seen. There was an attempt to escape again, and Franklin just had it by then. Up to that point, the prisoners were able to wear their own clothing, but then he forced them into what was called magpie, and that's the prisoner's uniform. Now, you think it would be difficult to escape wearing that? Everything that man has a number. So when you came to Van Diemen's Land, you received a number. Your hat would have a number. Your pants would have a number. The broad arrows said, this is British government. You were in big trouble if you lost it or if you had the wrong number. But that's what they were put into. That's called magpie.
Was that all of the prisoners or just the Patriots?
No, all the prisoners, the Patriots didn't have to until this next escape.
Okay.
So if you go to some of the museums in Tasmania, you will see some of these original magpie costumes. Prisoners then that tried to escape there were sent to Port Arthur, but at the Hobart Town Prisoners Barracks, where they stopped off, this is something that was there. What is that?
It looks like a treadmill.
It's a treadmill, and it's not dogs or horses, it's
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
So this is what they had in Hobart at the prisoners' barracks to grind grain. They were then sent to Green Ponds, and this is like an amalgamation story. When I went to Tasmania, I was looking for Green Ponds, and you think I could find it? It wasn't on a map, it wasn't anywhere. Well, they changed the name from Green Ponds to Kempton, and no one told me that, and there's no signs, so I had a hell of a time finding the place. But this is what's left. This is the courthouse and the police station. While there, the Patriots built St. Mary's Anglican Church, which is still there in Kempton. There was a great furor about this. People said at the time in the newspapers, why are convicts building churches? They should be out building roads and ditches. But they built that church, and it's there for you to see. They built that bridge, a wonderful 1840 bridge, some sandstone drainage work, and sandstone culverts. So that's the kind of thing they did at Green Ponds. They were then sent to Bridgewater, and they were building this, which was out of the Illustrated London News of 1851. This is a causeway and a bridge. The problem was, and Arthur started this project when he was there was quicksand in this area, and as they built it, it kept sinking. But it was finally built and opened in 1849. Some of the remains of the original work. This is the remains of the Granton Quarry, where they got the building material. Some of the building walls, and this is all private property. Superintendent's house. So these are just remnants of what's left. And this is another watch house at Granton. Now, David asked me about Tasmania, and I'll answer his question now. It's 26,383 square miles in area. It's south of Sydney, and a 1.5 hour air flight, and the only thing south of Tasmania is Antarctica. So it's 226 miles north to south, 190 miles east to west. It's about the size of Ireland or Switzerland or the state of West Virginia, so that gives you an idea of it. Franklin then decided, and he was having a heck of a time governing at this point for a number of reasons. He decided that he was going to finally break up this large group of men into smaller groups. And he did that. And some were sent to Newtown Bay, and this is all that's left of the Newtown Probation Station, a 6-cell prisoner block. Another view of it. There's a hulk here, which was a way that kept keeping prisoners aboard redundant ships. So there was a hulk there. And this is one of the bridges they built. Another group was sent to Jericho. This is all that remains of the Jericho Probation Station. It was a mud block. It was burned in a bushfire, which they have problems with to this day. This is the only interpretive sign I've found in Tasmania, and that's why I think our blue and yellow signs or gold signs are wonderful. This is the only way you would have known that that was the Jericho Probation Station. They just aren't good at signage. This is the superintendent's house in Jericho. 2 visits ago I was there, and you could have bought this for your summer house for $1 million Australian.
Oh, really?
What a bargain. They were also sent out to work when they were on their ticket of leave or probation to large farms, and this is the Park Farm near Jericho. This is the type of work they would do. Convict labor on the roads, convict labor carrying timber. The North Americans were prized because they knew how to use axes. So they were taken to probation stations that were being built because of that. Another group went to the east. This is the view of the Coal River Valley. They were building a road east to west. And there's a plan of a probation station. So you can see how extensive it is. And this is where you would house prisoners. And the political prisoners were helping build this place. Now, my friend Graham Rari has kindly done this for me because it's the only way you can understand it. There's a computer-generated three-dimensional layout of the Jerusalem probation station. There's another view of it. And that puts it in the context of what it would have looked like. So you can see it's a large complex. Now, if you look at it today from the air, that's that complex, but you can see there's lots of buildings missing. And also, if you're not up in an airplane, you can't see it from the ground. This is Waterdale, which was the superintendent's house. This is where my friends, the Ryries, live, and the doctors and assistant superintendent's house. This is part of the bakery and the convict accommodations. Remember, these are all private buildings, so you can't just waltz in and look at them. And this is a building that I couldn't get into until the previous owner sold it, because he wasn't a very pleasant man, and the new owners allowed me in. This is the hospital at Jerusalem. And this is a period store in that area. The next group were sent to Browns River. This hazy little sketch of Browns River done in 1845, but with a close-up, can you faintly see what that is? Yes, it's a convict working party, which you rarely see in any views, but that's at Browns River. This gives you an idea of Browns River in 1841, drawn by the Superintendent Chapman. Now what's sad about Browns River, it's a modern subdivision. There's no signage, no one would know it's there. This is all that's left of it. That's a remains of a solitary cell. And this is what I do when I'm in Tasmania. Crawl through convict-built culverts. That's hard to say quickly. And this is near Browns River. If you're in Hobart, this is a little gem that people don't go. They all flock off to Port Arthur, but this is the prisoners' barracks and penitentiary, or what's left of it. It used to be an entire block. It's a museum, so if you're in Hobart, make sure you go and see it, because when you get inside, most of it's original. Now, men were sent there on their way down to the Tasman. Now, we don't need to focus that, because every time I go there, it rains. So that's the catechist house in a rainstorm. Good reason I should go back and get a better picture. There's the superintendent's quarters. This is down in the Tasman Peninsula. Portion of the prisoners' barracks. Again, these are all privately owned. You can see the terrible condition many of the buildings are in, which is a shame, actually. There's another remains of a solitary cell. This is a wonderful hospital, and when I was there, I guess 2 times ago, it was up for sale for 1.2 million Australian dollars. It's actually a wonderful building. Now, I'm going to try to bring this to a close. There were huge problems in this whole system. First of all, it was a system brought from England. It was underfunded. At one point, they were sending prisoners to New South Wales, but they stopped that, so they were all being flooded into Van Diemen's Land, and they couldn't support this. They had people such as this man, who was Superintendent de Gillerin, and he was so incompetent that he was fired. He was considered unfit for duty, and you can see him there with his wife and his dog, and we can see, again, a prisoners' gang working there. So he was incompetent. The next group, this is at Rocky Hills, and you can see again the size of the probation station. They were large, large institutions. All that's left is two buildings, a store, a barn, and the superintendent's quarters. This is on the eastern side of Tasmania. That's the superintendent's quarters. Remains of the lime kiln. This is actually one of the bridges they built on the road that was going along the ocean at Lavender Bay. That's the original road. And it looks a lot like that first image I showed of Bainbridge, except there's eucalyptus trees in this picture. Next group were sent to 9 Mile Marsh. They were supposed to drain this area, have it as a self-sustaining farm. It was a British idea. They didn't realize that things happened to freeze there in the winter, and so after about 3 years it was completely abandoned. There's my friend John Thompson showing that's what's left of the long building at Victoria Valley. And we spent a whole day looking for this. This is all that remains of the 7 Mile Creek probation station. Lady Franklin and Sir John Franklin actually went here, documented travel to see this. There's the road they were building in Victoria Valley. So let me just bring this talk to an end. First of all, people say, well, why don't we know about this history? Well, one of the reasons is because these men were just individuals. They weren't Chartists from Wales. They weren't known for their politics. They were just individuals. So these men were sent down there for 2 years, and if they didn't reoffend, then they would be given the ticket of leave, which eventually led to this. And that's what you wanted to get. That's an actual pardon of Orrin Smith. That's what you get. Now there's a problem. You're free, you're pardoned, but remember you only got a one-way ticket down there. So the problem is, how do you get home? And they would hope to get on whaling ships going back to the States. What did these men look like? Well, again, they were common men. This is Benjamin Waite, who was captured at the Short Hills battle, and he did escape, actually. A number of them escaped. And there's Waite, and then later in life, living in the United States. The men that went to England for trial, it was amazing, reading period newspapers. And this is actually a view of those on trial out of the London Sun. And a number of those men were actually sent to Van Diemen's Land. A number of the other men were pardoned. There's Parker right there, boxmaker extraordinaire. John Burrell Tyrrell was one of the only Canadians. That's not him standing there, that's Mike Baker, who's the curator of the Elgin County Museum, but that's Tyrrell's gravestone. Does anybody know who Malin Burwell was?
Yeah, well, Port Burwell.
That's right, but what was his job? Do you know what his job was? He was a surveyor. He was part of the family compact. So John Burwell Tyrrell was a nephew, and there's thought that because of his political pull, he was the first patriot to receive a pardon and come back. And so he came back to Malahide, near where that submarine is high and dry and going bankrupt. So that's his little memorial. One of the few Canadians.
And these patriots, they were all Americans.
Majority were, yes. And that's another quite different thing from the rebellion of 37, because they were all Canadians. It was internal. This apparently is the only picture ever taken of Franklin. Okay? So this is in here, and this is what he would have looked like just before he went on his last trip to the north. But I put this in because, remember, he was there from 1837 to 1843. He was then basically shunted out, sent back to England, and he was so upset about that, he spent a year writing a book. Bond Head wrote books too, but he wrote a book kind of saying why he was so hard done by. And then he went up north, and he's still there as far as we know.
Yeah.
Um, Now this is an interesting commemorative statue of Sir John Franklin. Now remember, he was driven out, and I thought, oh, well maybe the local burghers in Hobart Town have changed their minds. They built this wonderful statue. It's in Franklin Park. Isn't this lovely? Then I found out that actually the money was raised by Lady Franklin, and she even asked the President of the United States to assist. He declined gracefully. But the statue's there.
Well, Mrs. Franklin was a lady of means.
Yes, she was.
She spent big dollars trying to find them up in the Arctic. Where the money came from, I have no idea. But
Well, she-
Well, she scared the admirals silly.
She-
They
she-
did anything.
She raised the money for that statue,
Yep.
and she also built the first museum in Tasmania. She I think was quite a, yeah. Sir George Arthur, he was in Van Diemen Land from 1832 to 1836, and Upper Canada from 1838 to 1840. He went back to England, then he was sent to India. So I think he was in this position where he was landed in Upper Canada in the middle of a rebellion. He executed a number of them, and there was this huge outcry and petition, and he realized we can't execute everybody. This is going to be trouble. And in the meantime, there were the hunters' lodges all along from Vermont to Michigan. There was up to 200. They expected 200,000 people in these hunters' lodges. So there was a real threat. So he decided, well, what we'll do is we'll execute the ringleaders. We'll send the young men either to the Kingston Penitentiary, or we'll send them across the border, and then we'll send the other people to Van Diemen's Land. So that's what he did. Now, just to end, and we were talking about incompetence of governments, and let's talk about this. So here we've got the Sandy Bay Cairn. And this was put up by the Canadian government in 1970, and this was to commemorate the men I'm talking about. Well, that's all nice, except they put it up in a place that has no connection to the story. Problem. So since 1995, I've been asking them to move it, and they finally took it down, they being Hobart City Council. And remember, the Canadian government put this up. The Canadian government refused to get involved in funding to put it back up. So it sat in storage for years, doing nobody any good. And finally, this February, Hobart City Council put it back up again with no help from the Canadian government. In the meantime, in 2005, this cairn was then put up by the Canadian government after the first cairn, as if we needed another one. And it was put even in a worse place, which has again nothing to do with the story I'm telling, and yet it's still there. So another stupid move. The only one that really is of relevance is this little one, which no one knows exists. And this is the cairn at the Campbell Street Public School. And that in itself is a problem, because when you go to take a picture of it, everybody thinks you're a pervert. You know, you're taking a picture of the kids in the playground. What this is actually the burial ground, and then the school's been built over it. And on that is an interesting poem written by Linus Miller. He went looking for his colleague Alexander MacLeod, and they were buried as convicts. They were buried without a headstone. So that's the only one that has any relevance to this story. But then again, what can we expect from the Canadian government? Just to end, I don't know if anybody doing research has read an American journal called Niles National Register. It was kind of like Look magazine. You've read that?
Oh, yeah, I got several of them.
It's a great period. Well, it's a newspaper, all right, and it was in various places. But so in March 26, 1846. There was an article in the Niles National Register, and it was entitled "Exiles from Van Diemen." Now I remember they were sent down there, and then by about mid-1840s there was this movement in the United States to bring these men back. So it says it reported 9 New York State Patriots landed in New Bedford. Why would they have landed in New Bedford?
Really?
Whaling time. It said, quote, "These men have suffered much, and their tale is one of deep interest, and calculated to move every heart to sympathy." Now, I don't know if I've done that with you tonight. However, the fact of the matter is that I think it's an important story in our history that few people know about, and I hope tonight that I've given you some information that you didn't know about, and that you've enjoyed this. So I'm quite open, once we get the lights on, to questions. I also have 2 books here. One is specifically on the rebellion, which is the Ontario History Special Edition that I edited, and that's $10. And if anybody's interested in the War of 1812, there's the double edition of Ontario History for $20. That's the sales pitch. And I'll turn this off, and I'd be quite pleased to answer any of your questions.
What was the purpose of the Patriots? Were they trying to
I was gonna
take over?
Good question, and I didn't explain that very well. What was the purpose of the Patriots? First of all, they called themselves the Patriots because, again, it goes back to 1776. There's a number of them that actually believed, and what they wanted to do is overthrow the British government in Upper Canada, because they thought that British government was tyranny. So some of them believed them. Okay. Others, there were inducements that if the Patriots had won, men would get land, they would get money, so there were those kind of inducements, nothing to do with patriotism. There was a bad depression in the United States and Canada at that time, so a lot of these young men were unemployed, and they just kind of joined on. The Hunters' Lodges, I think, they were kind of entertainment. Every little town had them, and they'd have meetings every week, and so they went to those meetings, and they never thought they'd really go and shoot people, but they did, and so that was the reason. In fact, if
It'd be no different than these young people going to Syria today.
well, in some ways, I think that we have to remember that if Bond Head, when he sent the troops away, if Patriots had won that first battle at Fort Mullen, taken Fort Mullen, who knows what would have happened. But after 13 incursions, in every one they were beaten back. Would you want to join that group? So it withered away, and by about 1840 it really didn't exist. At one point they named a president for the Republic of Canada, a vice president, they had a bank. There was all sorts of strange things that never came to fruition. But, it could have.
What did the American government think about this idea?
Good question. There was a Neutrality Act, so there was no official support from the American federal government. President Van Buren and his army generals tried quite hard to stop the incursions. There was some question about whether state governments and state governors there was some thought that they might be supportive, but it wasn't officially sanctioned by the Americans. And again, I think once they saw that nothing really was happening, you got to remember that Texas and Mexico was happening at the same time, but it wasn't officially sanctioned.
That shot of you standing at the opening of the culvert, the prisoner's culvert there, when you walked through there, what were you looking for? What are you examining in detail?
Well, first of all, I was with my friend John Thompson, the man with the long beard, and he's probably the most knowledgeable of probation stations. What he didn't tell me when we're crawling around in there, that there was lots of poisonous snakes. I said, John, thanks a lot, right? We were just looking at what remained of stonework that they did. That was a culvert that would drain down, and so you could walk in and you could see their work, and you don't see that often. Fortunately, I didn't run into any of those snakes, but he said, oh, you know, this is well known for these, some poisonous viper that's slippery about. So that's what we're doing in there.
The superintendent's houses were remained, but there was a substantial howling. Handsome and quite powerful individual superintendents of these stations.
Yes, they were, but unfortunately, most of them were incompetent, like Van Gilren, and that was a huge problem to the system, that they didn't have the money, they didn't have the staff, even with the buildings. I mean, they kept having to build them to just house them. You have to remember that the British used to send felons to the United States as prisoners until after 1776, and then they ran out of space in England, and they were sending them to Bermuda and Cyprus and all over the place, and then they decided, well, Australia is the place to send them, so it was a huge problem.
Does anybody really live there other than prisoners?
In those buildings?
Yeah, I mean, do people move there from Australia or?
Oh, sure. I mean, at one point, though, there were more prisoners than there were free people. It was a good farming, the island was good for farming, and but there was a huge problem, and I think, I'm working on an article right now about newspaper reports in Australian papers, because, we didn't have the internet then, but they were quite interested. It was, about 6 to 8 months after the fact, but they'd report all these things in Upper Canada, and I think that they were afraid, with all these prisoners, that there might be an uprising in Van Diemen's Land. So it's fascinating. I'm going to be tracking. I think they've actually reporting battles after the guys that were captured in the battle were sent down there. So they didn't have the luxury of reading the newspaper, but I mean, Josiah Woodman would talk about when he was free about, reading the papers and wondering why they weren't set free. Yes?
I'm not sure of the timeline, but if I'm not mistaken, I did read that when the Highland clearances were going on, they were sending people from Scotland there too. But I don't know if it was there or whether it was Australia. I know it was in that direction. They're sending in all directions, some to Upper Canada, some. So I'm wondering if some of the Scottish prisoners might have been some of the stonemasons.
Oh yes, they were. Actually, a couple stonemasons were so proficient at their jobs that they were given their freedom for the stonework. Before I forget, who won that? Something, yes. Any other questions?
Yeah, how did the Fenians fit into this little bit of history?
Glad you brought that up, because people get confused about that. The Fenians have
Was
nothing
that
to
the last attempt of the Patriots?
No, Fenians have nothing to do with this, and people get it confused. That's why Paley Island put out Fenian Cuvée, because they didn't know. Fenians were 1860s. They were Irish. Most of them came out of the battle-hardened out of the Civil War. They actually invaded Canada at a number of places, but it has nothing to do with this. It was more Irish independence, and they probably needed to do something after the Civil War. So, but they were spectacularly unsuccessful too.
That's right.
So the Patriots then really just took advantage of the fact that Upper Canada and Lower Canada were in a bit of a state after the 1837 rebellion.
I'm gonna ask a question.
Tied together or not?
I don't think they are. I mean, I think Chris Rabel would say they are, but in my mind, they're two separate events, because the Upper Canadian Rebellion was internal, all Canadians. The 1838 events were incursions for a different reason. It wasn't to promote democracy. I mean, that's what. And what happened was that Durham's report, eventually it was written, and then many of the things that Mackenzie wanted came to fruition because of Durham's report.
Were any of the rebels from the 1837 rebellion part of that 1838?
Yeah, there were. Particularly on Davie Island, which was the first. There was only one man who was involved and actually has a prisoner's box, who was sent to Van Diemen's Land. McLeod, I think his name was.
Yeah,
He died a week after he arrived.
that's right.
So it was mostly, again, because remember, 37, they were mostly Canadians, but some of them did go over to Navy Island, and James Mackenzie, who was William's son, was at Pelee Island, was at Fighting Island, so there were some, but not many.
The 58 French speaking out of the 98, so the majority, were they from the Windsor area then? Like where were the,
No,
where were the francophones from?
Lower Canada had a rebellion too. Okay, so 37 there was upper, lower,
Yeah,
38 upper and lower. I didn't explain that. So the French Canadians, or the French speaking, were sent to Sydney. They came to Hobart Town, they let the English speaking off, then they journeyed on to Sydney.
I'm wondering where they came from to begin with.
Lower Canada.
Lower Canada.
Lower Canada.
Yeah.
So those hunters things that were in Vermont or New England or whatever,
Hunters' lodges were all across from Vermont to Michigan.
and that's where the francophone
No, no.
Patriots.
Oh,
I'm trying to figure this out
you're
here.
talking about, I'm bad at French, but there was a French version of Hunters, but the Hunters' lodges were in America. There were some in Canada too. And there was thought that at one point there were 200,000 members, because every little town, you read the New York newspapers, every little town had the, Hunters' Lodge meetings. And I mean, that was a real threat if all those guys had come across. But the Battle of Windmill, people in Ogdensburg and in Detroit were all waving and cheering, but then they thought, that's all we're going to do. We're not going to cross there and get shot.
So, but none of the battles you mentioned were French.
None of the which?
None of the battles that you mentioned were in Lower Canada.
No, because I didn't talk about that.
Oh, okay.
I've only
But
talked.
that's where the majority or
That's where the
half
58.
of the prisoners came from.
That's where the 58 came from.
Okay.
And were sent to Sydney. They were kept in Sydney. Pierre Trudeau actually went and put up a plaque in the right place for them.
Back to the probation stations.
Yeah.
How many years were they actually used for?
Let me think. I think 1855. Transportation ended, which was sending them, and the whole penal system was changed. So then those stations became invalid hospitals, various things, and eventually they were sold off. And that's why even to today they're owned privately. The state, I don't know why the state hasn't invested in, they could have bought the Rocky Hills and they didn't. But they're not interested.
Do you
They
think they
only-
don't, do you think they don't want to hark back to their convict
Yeah, probably.
Van
No,
Diemen's
look,
Land
that's
history?
changing. No, that's all changing. Since Robert Hughes wrote his book, people now are taking interest. I have people contacting me all the time because I know of the men that stayed there. They know the history down there, but they don't know the history in New York State. So there's this growing interest. And that all came out of Robert Hughes's Fatal Shores book. But you're right, before that they didn't want to say, money. I mean, I've got
So at the critical point when all those buildings were abandoned or sold or whatever they did with them,
Well-
there was probably quite a long period of time when no one was putting up plaques and setting some of them aside and turning them into museums or whatever.
well, and a lot of them were actually taken apart because it was good building
Yeah,
material
good
and they
building
used them
blocks.
for other things.
Yeah.
Right.
But, it'd be nice if we had one. You
Yeah.
can go to Port Arthur and they spent millions and millions there. And that only tells the story of second offenders, right? So, yes.
We use the term penal system, reformatory, penitentiary. Is there a philosophy that is changing of what we do with them? We warehouse them, or we reform them, or we just punish them? What was going on there?
Well, it's a difficult one to answer, but I'll try to do it quickly. Initially, it was punishment. You were sent there. You were sent as far away as you could be. Then, even at Port Arthur, they started changing even the configuration, and when there were reforms in England, those reforms came, and so later on it wasn't punishment anymore. And then there was an argument of those that were against transportation, were saying that basically, the felons from England that were sent from London, their lives were better going to Australia, and that's probably true. But it was an evolution. And then eventually there was a movement against transportation, and it came to an end.
Were they reasonably well treated there?
Depends whose book you read. A lot of the narratives, of course, were what we would call, I guess, propaganda, and they said they were whipped. They were never whipped. Prisoners were whipped, but not the political prisoners. They were never shackled, and yet some of the books say we were shackled. So, it was a hard life, but it wasn't as bad as some of them make it out to be. But that was all propaganda. When they got back, they were saying, this is bad. Blah, blah, blah. So you have to, when you read those books, you got to kind of say, well, why are they writing this?
You mentioned the name John Howard. Is that like the John Howard Society?
Yes, but also he was the architect in Toronto that donated Hyde Park, and his house, Colburn Lodge, is still there. But he was a big-time architect in Toronto.